Good morning and welcome to the Key Changes to Clinical Evaluation in China webinar. My name is Veronica McBride from AdvaMed, and I will be your host for today's webinar. We also have a team of AdvaMed staff behind the scenes running the technical portion of the program, monitoring questions and troubleshooting. If you experience any technical difficulties during the webinar, please first attempt to exit the broadcast and then rejoin. We provided a troubleshooting and information guide located in the chat feature at the bottom of your screen. Please refer to it throughout the session if necessary. If any of the panelists experience any audio or technical difficulties, please let us know by using the chat function. This session is being recorded, and a link will be provided to you in an email within a few days following the conclusion of this session. We will also be sending an email with the post-session survey immediately following today's program. Each participant is in listen-only mode, meaning that your line is muted. There will be an opportunity for questions at the end of this presentation. If you have any questions, please post them in the chat feature. If taking live questions, please remember today's broadcast is being recorded. And by asking a live question, you consent to being recorded. We will begin today's opening introduction with Mr. Kyle Churchman. Now let's get started with the program. It is my pleasure to introduce Mr. Kyle Churchman, Director of Global Strategy and Analysis from AdvaMed.
Thank you, Veronica, and good morning all. I too want to welcome everyone to today's webinar. As many of you know, in June, China mandated a set of extensive changes to its medical device regulations, known as Order 739. Since then, China's regulator has issued a slew of new and revised technical guidelines, and this is especially true in the area of clinical evaluation. To sort through the key changes to clinical trials, clinical evaluation reports, exemption lists, and more, we are delighted to have two knowledgeable speakers today. Grace Fu Palma is CEO and founder of China Med Device, a consulting firm that advises clients on how to navigate China's regulatory environment. Before establishing her consulting firm a decade ago, Grace worked as an executive in two medical technology companies. Based in Boston, Grace is a regular speaker at key national and local medtech gatherings, including AdvaMed's annual MedTech conference. Our other speaker is Ms. Xiaopeng Zhang from Johnson & Johnson, China. Dr. Zhang oversees registration for all new J&J product lines in China and has considerable experience with clinical evaluation reports, both in terms of the actual writing and strategies for product approval. She holds a doctorate in medical science from China's Central South University. With that brief introduction, I now want to hand it over to Grace. Thank you.
Thank you very much for AdvaMed to give us this opportunity to share with you our interpretation and experience regarding the State Order 739 follow-up regulations. There are many regulations since then. We're focusing today on the highlights of the clinical evaluation aspect of it. The agenda is I'll start off with the quick high-level overview of 739 impacts on the clinical evaluation area and talk about the clinical pathways. And then Dr. John is going to take a deeper dive, particularly on the CER report area, followed by the Q&A. It's impossible to go over all the details of clinical evaluation. We will hit the highlights, give you the roadmap so you know what to follow up. Because parallel to this talk, there are 2 days of solid, more detailed training directly offered by NMPA as well. So thanks you, Kyle, for introducing both myself and Dr. Zhang. I started my career probably older than some of you many years ago. What we do is we provide the China market access solution from the regulatory to CRO. This China as a regulation, for product registration, you must have an in-country representation. As an overseas manufacturer, you cannot register directly. As such, we can be your legal agent in China for your registration. And there are many changes. China regulations is like a teenager trying to growing up fast. So we track every month. There are many changes in guidance, standards, policies, adverse events for the complete product life cycle. It's impossible for anybody to keep track of all of this. So we publish this monthly newsletter that is complimentary to everybody to help you keep tab on what's going on for that month with the different areas. In addition, at the end of the year, we have this complimentary blue book that captures the entire year. So we have the previous years as well as the current year. That keep you more up to date with our intelligence portal. And there are a lot more other comments about what's going on with China and NMPA. So the background on the clinical evaluation. Clinical evaluation we're focusing on is for class 2 and class 3 medical devices. Class 1 is a filing. It's pretty straightforward. It takes a month to do the file if your documents are complete. So before we delve into the clinical evaluation, I just want to make sure people are understanding the different hierarchies of what you are looking at, because this is very important. 739 is issued by the State Council of China. That's like the White House. It's higher than the FDA. It's higher than the NMPA. That's the centralized government highest authority. It's the law. So 739 is the law. It's Order 739. It governs the whole umbrella of NMPA. Once the 739 is issued, NMPA can follow the direction of this law to issue a series of regulations at the NMPA level, and then followed by the next level of the technical review guidelines. So when we talk about today's clinical evaluation, bear in mind there are different levels, and different levels would capture different level of details. So the law is the highest level, and then the regulation, and then the industry standard, national standards, whether you're doing clinical evaluation or not. The non-technical requirements in China is mandatory, especially with the GB standards. That's, the next level of information. So I explained here what the differences are. And if you look at the highest law level, this migration of history, I started before the 2000. That's when China's first law level, overarching law level about regulation for medical devices is the regulation on supervision administration. The first one really started in 2000. And before that, I was involved with medical device. You don't have to register. You can sell anything in China without approval. And then since 2014, when President Xi became the president, he initiated a serious reform with the 650. And we all went through that. It was very rigid. The CR requirements, I'll talk more about the clinical aspect of it. And then they realized that it's too rigid and there are a lot of details needs to be followed. And then China wants to initiate into the innovation pathway and want to have more quality products. So the deepening the reform is followed by 680, and then it's followed by 739. As you can see, since 2014, there has been a series of law level, the highest level changes. And subsequently, you will see different details as well. So if you look at the clinical evaluation history, because we're not talking about registration requirement, we're talking about one of the components, the clinical evaluation history since the initial 2000. as I mentioned, I started before then. For the domestic product, it does require a lot of devices, require clinical trial. It was, but for the overseas, it was very simple. I can just write a clinical evaluation report myself. As well as the registration, I was doing that myself for our products when I was managing a startup company. But then since 2014, it's impossible. The technical requirement, clinical requirement, all intensified. The good old days where you just write a basic summary for overseas manufacturer is reformed with 2014, as a lot of you have experienced. And then China realized, especially later on, about too much restriction really impedes the innovation, the approval of new technologies from overseas. So China is learning. So subsequently, with the 739 as the overarching law, the registration and filing administration measures kicked in October of this year, and there are more relaxation specifically in the clinical evaluation history. So especially, as I mentioned, since the 2014 was very rigid initially, and then when China joined the IMDRF and became its chairperson as the clinical evaluation committee. So as you can see, China NMPA really made a lot of contribution in working with overseas manufacturers. They're representing the 10 countries. So since 2018, 19, 2020, NMPA issued a series of clinical evaluation related guidance and document. It's really important to note that, especially for both China regulatory people as well as the overseas, clinical evaluation, when it was first introduced in 2014 as a concept, was pretty much everything is clinical trial. If you're not on the exempt list, without a predicate device. If you need a predicate device, back then was very rigid. You need authorization. So as NMPA is learning, so you can see in 2018 January, China developed more detailed, whether it's clinical design guidance, and then they allowed overseas clinical trial data. Before this clinical trial data acceptance was released, it doesn't matter whether you did overseas clinical trial, you still have to repeat it in China. So in this past few years, with overseas acceptance for IVD is a different acceptance guidance. So medical device and IVD both have NMPA published acceptance guidance. And then with the IMDRF, there was 3 documents that was released in 2018-19 timeframe. I think it's 2019, that has the more definition of what does it mean for clinical evaluation, what's the definition, how do you prove the evidence. So all these concepts were released in 2019 November. So these are it's in English. Go on IMDRF website, because these are an important foundation that NMPA used to support the 739 series of clinical evaluation. So, and then when 2020 comes, after this IMDRF policy, China adopted and tried to be more internationally harmonized and issued a series of China-specific clinical evaluation. Clinical evaluation now, the concept is encompass of everything from clinical trial is a form of clinical evaluation, predicate is a form of clinical evaluation. So clinical evaluation now is the umbrella. Try to change your frame of thinking from the old clinical evaluation to the current. So as you can see in the 2020, the series of guidance document issued, in addition to the overseas acceptance, the real world data, that's your experience data, that can be used to supplement some of the gaps. And then the post-market data can be used. So more and more guidance were issued. So as you can see that I use this picture to demonstrate that China is growing up fast. in this 20 years, and if you look at it's like a teenager compared to the FDA years. The FDA year started in 1938. So when you're a grandfather, you're pretty matured. You have thousands of biostats and experts to support you in the FDA. But in China, there are only limited people, and the teenagers growing fast, but also there are a lot of changes. There are constant changes. And maybe you started off this year, and then some of our clients would say, oh, why am I have to change this? Why do I have to do this? Because you have teenagers, if you have kids, you know how they work, right? So, but it's all changing towards a more harmonization, more trying to reduce the burden for overseas manufacturers as well. So here is a quick slide on the 739. Their changes that was effective June 1st, as I mentioned. The key principles I'm not going to go through. I just show you, we'll send you the slides if you need it, so you have an idea of the changes. You can see from here, the old 80 now is 107. The gray is more of the old 680, now 739. You see the under the blue, the key area changes. There are a lot of changes in the post-market area, particularly reflected in the 739 when it comes to the clinical pathway or clinical evaluation. Here is a quick summary. And in terms of the principle, one of the key framework, I think the principle changing of thinking is to allow different non-clinical trial data before choosing clinical trial. Whereas before, if you don't have predicate and authorization, no clinical trial data, you're pretty much host. You have to do local trial unless you are meeting the overseas clinical acceptance. But here in this new regulation law environment, it allow you more versatile data. More, and also the change, the catalog is called clinical trial exempt. Now it's called clinical evaluation exempt. Clinical trial exempt means you still have to do a clinical evaluation, because if you look at the hierarchy of the effort, right, the best thing is you don't have to do anything. You just summarize your technical and clinical justification. If you're on the clinical trial exempt catalog in the old days, you still have to really try hard to work on clinical evaluation. There's the simple clinical evaluation, there's the complex one, depending on how much evidence you have. Now it's called the clinical evaluation. I'll talk more in the next slide, in the few down the slides, but at least it's more dynamic. It's not a clear-cut black and white anymore. So the clinical exempt conditions and expanded and clarified. And I'll talk more about this principle. If its product is pretty clear, it's matured, working mechanism is clear, no post-market AE, you may not need a clinical evaluation anymore. You clearly don't need it as much anymore. And then for the clinical trial improvement, they're also spelled out. There's a subsequent regulation to support it and how to make that process more streamlined. And essentially, at the end of the day, there are two key concepts where you need a clinical trial, where we'll talk more. But this is the highest level. 739 doesn't tell you how or the details. That's the follow-on regulation. We'll talk some of them. 739 is just setting the principle that, okay, we should think like this. What is the theoretical thinking framework? And then more ways to approve and support the unapproved devices. Like now there's the conditional approval for rare disease, post-market follow-ups, emergency use, we're all familiar, and also the special geographic imports, especially for certain devices where you want to parallel entry to China, you have the approval, and then there's the multinational trial center. There are more pathways that allow you access to China. For the unapproved geographical imports, these are the Greater Bay Area, the Hainan policy, where the requirements to get used in these two regions in China is significantly less than the national approval. So at least to get your foot into the door in these two regions, And while you are trying to apply for the national registration. So at least you can get some ethnic data, some real world data for these special two geographic area that you can use. And then, for the IVD, the LDT concepts is first introduced in under the 739. As I mentioned, the 739 is the highest law level, and then followed by the supporting regulations that will be issued by NMPA and associated the different departments. So as you can see, the right under 739, the next level regulation is the Provincial for Medical Device Registration and Filing, and as well as for the IVD. There are two separate ones. This kicked in October 1st. So we're not going to talk about these today. We're more focusing on the clinical evaluation. I want to show you this to let you know that there are a lot of other regulations that came into effect as well, like self-testing, that the details for self-testing is issued by NMPA as well. And the IVD related, I highlight those in red. So now, just a quick summary of the regulation level. This is below the 739 law level. So, and the NMPA regulation level. So the key question that is answered, I highlighted some of the key new important guidance. There's English copy for these guidelines as well that you can request a copy. So we also have our email at the bottom of each slide footnotes as well. So if you look at the clinical evaluation, there's how do you do it? And how do you prepare for the reports? There's specific guidance to address these questions. So you have the guidelines, and then the how's questions is addressed by these guidelines. So clearly with the 739, the follow-on regulations, there are more specificity of how to do these things. And clinical trial is, of course, everybody wants to avoid it. But what's the decision tree? How do you know whether you should do clinical trial or not? So there is guidelines on deciding on how to do that. So I highlighted that in red because that's important. And then if you have to do clinical trial, there's the updated guidance on the clinical trial, the design and the trial data. So make sure you read the latest updated guidance. I think the other key to avoid a clinical trial, to understand that initially a lot of manufacturers struggle with is what is considered as the equivalency. So this concept is expanded further. I have a slide to talk more about it. And then the real world data to help you support. So these are the key thinking guidance. When you make your decision, develop your strategy, try to see where you fit. So for class 2 and class 3, before we get into what clinical evaluation pathway should you go under, before you do that, this NMPA have this important document that is part of also the international guidance as well. In the 2018 IMDRF, it has medical device safety and performance essential principles. And NMPA adopted this EP, Essential Principles for the Safety and Performance, in 2020. So this is, have the English version as well. So it's basically, take a look of this basic essential principles. If you're, according to these essential principles, your clinical evaluation is maybe needed, not necessarily you have to do it. Read this through this guidance document. And it's based on the clinical requirements. Medical devices may require clinical evaluation. This is accepted by NMPA officially in this, by accepting this 2020 adopted this EP, I call it essential principles. If based on these essential principles, you follow, you decide, okay, should I do evaluation? Should I do clinical trial? Because if you meet this essential principle guidance. You may not need even a clinical evaluation. This is accepted by NMPA. So that's why I start off with this EP principle. And once you look at the EP principle, okay, and you said, I got to do clinical evaluation or I got to do clinical trial. So this is the step you need to go through on the clinical evaluation. And then, as I mentioned, this becomes more scientific now, particularly before you have the equivalency. And how do you determine the comparable? So the comparable and equivalency with the updated clinical evaluation guidance document, there are more specificity about equivalency and comparable. So if you have, there's nothing that exactly the same, right? Medical devices always, a lot of times, an NMPA reviewers said it. It's a lot of times evolutionary. It's not a breakthrough, not a brand new design, not a brand new like a clinical trial required. So look at the equivalency or comparable. There's specific guidance documents there. And look at the gap. And if it's the same, you don't have to justify. If there are a gap, whether it's small differences or large differences, you pretty much gap justify it through non-clinical or clinical data. When it comes to clinical data, the data source is the key. And then there are different rankings that Dr. John is going to talk more about the equivalency side of the clinical data. What is, how you look at this data? How do you look at this equivalency? So this part, Dr. John is going to talk more in detail. And then on the clinical trial side, again, you know, if you have sufficient data to justify, you don't have to do it. So this is a quick comparison between the 2014 versus 2021. And now it become for class 2 and class 3, there are only 2 pathways. One is how do you waive the clinical evaluation? And then if you have to do clinical evaluation, can you demonstrate it with equivalency similar? If you cannot, and then you got to do clinical trial. So there are primarily these 2 ways, and everybody wants to try to waive from clinical trial. And then you just do, as I mentioned, the detail of how to waive it, how to demonstrate the equivalency. Dr. John is going to talk more about it. And then this is an important catalog started in 2014. So this updated each year. You have key, you can contribute. If you're not on it, that means you have to do clinical evaluation through different pathways. So, but the important thing you can contribute is if you're not on it, try to submit why you should be on it. And maybe next time you'll be included. If you don't raise your hands to NMPA to submit that yours should be evaluated, they have a centralized group to evaluate this, to add products each year. So, and then the key is the decision tree. There's the guidance I mentioned earlier. Should you do clinical trial or should you not? The clinical trial decision I mentioned earlier, there's specific guidance. So basically there are 2 types of devices. One is high risk class 3 devices. And that's brand new, no predicates, is high class, class 3 high risk. You need to go through clinical trial only if you do not have sufficient overseas data, clinical trial data, sufficient justification of clinical, non-clinical data. And then you would need results in the decision tree. The other scenario is you have a new innovative medical device. If you just have a new evolutionary reformed medical device, you may not need clinical trial. You have, look at the equivalency, look at the similarity comparison. You may not need clinical trial. So if it's really new, innovative, and high class 3, you may need clinical trial. But remember, the word is may, it's not you must like before. So how do you evaluate this may? That's where, I can't teach you in an hour. That's where the series of document guidance you need to read through. And also, as an industry, we need to work with the NMPA to understand more the details. And on top of everything else, as I said, please look at the EP, the essential principles of safety and performance before you decide on that. So as I mentioned, if you are high risk, class 3, and your innovation, not evolution, there is overseas clinical data acceptance pathway. If you meet this if you've done overseas clinical trial, maybe you just need a supplementary trial in China. This supplementary trial could be a formal supplementary GCP trial, or it could go Hainan real-world data supplement. I'll talk a little bit about the real-world data support for the pre-submission supplement. So in the if it's overseas clinical trial you've done, you got to meet the China requirements. There's the specific requirements for overseas clinical trial guidance. Whether you meet it partially or complete meeting, and then the decision tree is whether you need a supplementary or not. So there's specific guidance. I'm not going into the details of the guidance, but just want to make sure you're aware of it. So the overseas basic principle is, ethic principle. This is the critical piece of it. The patient consent form. Do you have those? Do you have the PI required? All these basic principles to meet the requirement, whether it's legal or scientific, to prove that your validity of your trial is not an ad hoc type of published paper study. It's really a clinical trial that you meet all the clinical trial requirement. You meet overseas clinical trials sometimes when you come to China, also their China unique requirements. Make sure you look at both sides. So as I mentioned, sometimes your overseas clinical trial may need a supplementary study, and the real-world data could also help to fulfill that gap. So again, as I mentioned, it's the multiple pathways now is considered and accepted by NMPA. So this is all official. Before you have to, this reviewer accept this, that reviewer doesn't accept that. You have different opinions from different reviewers because there's no overarching regulation clearly in black and white words that tell you, okay, this is acceptable. So now you have a clear set. In addition to the 739 regulation, the law, you also have the subsequent regulations. So, and then, you have this real world data. This is more in the clinical experience. Clinical data, their NMPA clearly state there are 3 types of data, right? Your clinical trial data, that's the highest value. And then you have the clinical experience data, and you have the clinical literature data, coupled with the other sub-level information. So this is clinical experience data for the real world data. So the real world data, basically there's specific guidance on what's considered real world data. There are 11 usage here. This is all spelled out in the real world data guidance document. So for pre-market, if you look at 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, those are more pre-market. So it can be used if you see our pathway, you said there's some gap I can't fulfill, you can use real world data to support that. And for your overseas, there's ethnic or clinical practice with China that you feel is lacking, and then you can use the real world data to supplement it. So, so these listed 11 examples for pre and post-market areas that you can use, but real world data in by itself is not sufficient. It can be played as a supplementary role to justify. So this is just list the key area that you can use the real world data for by the China regulation. The other one I mentioned for the unapproved devices is evolving. I was at the first meeting before the pandemic in Hainan, where you see the red dot is, that's an island. The first meeting when they talked about the real world data and the unapproved devices usage. So I'm not going into the detail of what they are, but I listed the 3 criteria you need to meet to qualify for the special program. And then the Greater Bay Area is in the blue circle is in the Guangdong area. That's a different policy. Those are the 2 areas where you can use the unapproved devices. For the IVD-related updates, we're running out of the time, but I just want to quickly highlight that IVD is getting more specialized, unlike before. In China, initially IVD device, it's still in China, the device and reagents need 2 separate certificates, but IVD specific requirements, more and more regulation are coming out. And I mentioned the LDT, there's more specific information here. You can get the slides and study up on yourself. I don't have time to go into the details. And then this is comparator reagent selection. There's the new updates, as well as the registration, as I mentioned. The classification, again, the clinical exempt, all this is pretty much parallel. The thinking process is pretty much parallel to the medical device, except for IVD, there's a unique set of guidance documents as well. Again, it's impossible to go over all the details, so you can check the intelligence portal, finding out more information. There's also webinars there, especially on the unapproved devices that we did not get a chance to talk more in detail. So the key takeaway is least burdensome in the clinical evaluation. Try to think the least burdensome way. Not all products need clinical evaluation. Clinical evaluation encompasses all the different evaluations, clinical trial evaluation, predicate, similar products, through the essential principles. All these are part of the clinical evaluation. So at least it's not all product would need it anymore. And the CER dossier submission is not needed if it's in the clinical evaluation exemption list, which means you do not need the clinical evaluation report anymore for those on the exemption list. And then the key change, I think there's so many permutations depending how you look at it, is the evaluation system with multiple clinical evaluation pathways. So this is like you have many different ways to look at it. You have multiple data sources, and then the full use of various evidence to support your needs for the different products. So it's more customized instead of either this clinical evaluation, clinical trial, and there's a lot of more leeways, a lot more clinical evidence. So this encompasses you as a manufacturer, you got to be really articulating, really logical in convincing why you do not need a clinical trial. And NMPA certainly has this guidance, especially we're working on the justification for avoiding clinical trial, because in the past, like you have, China is often behind. In a lot of companies, they think about China as an afterthought. And then when it comes to China registration, their overseas product launch has happened already. And then by the China get approval, is 5 years behind already. So, and then now they're introducing the second generation. So can you use the first generation product clinical trial data to justify the second generation? Because your second generation in the US PMA does not need clinical trial anymore, because in second generation, but you have the first generation data. So can you use this data? So these kind of things are explained in the clinical trial decision guidance. So these are all good news for the overseas manufacturers, and definitely make it more I should say, a least burdensome way in your deficiency making about using the second generation product to justify for the first generation. If you can convincing enough with the changes not impacting the safety and efficacy. So that's the key point, and the only thing that changes, the only constant in China. So now I'm going to pass on to Dr. Zhang, who will talk more details about the CER.
This is what we get from the definition. In this May, NMPA had issued the draft clinical evaluation guideline. At that time, they said we might choose the subject device which is approved outside China. but not approved in China as the prick device. Sorry, Grace, please go back. And at that time, we think it's give the hope to the company that we can choose the predecessor which has been approved outside China. But when this September, the formal guidance issued, we know that only the products, the medical device which has been registered in China, we can choose it as the prick device. This is not good for most companies that we shorten the choice to choose the prick device. But another good thing is that we can have two choices. They give us the definition that the prick device includes one is equivalent device and the second is the similar device. What's the equivalent device? It's an ideal definition. Basically, it says that the scope of application and technical and biological characteristic of the subject of the prick device is the same as the subject device. It should be the very ideal condition. But I think maybe if we just, for example, we can think that if we have one predecessor which just have little design change, we may think it might be an equivalent device. And another definition is about the similar device. I know in EU regulations, MDR, it also have the definition of the similar device, but I'm not sure whether that definition is the exactly same as what mentioned in China guidance. But in China guidance, it mentioned which is a similar device. It should have the same scope of application with the subject device, but it might have the similar technical and biological characteristics compared with the subject device. So this time you can think maybe we have a little big design change, or maybe a little different material. That might be a similar device. And also in the guidance, the NMPA mentioned that the similar device can only give a partly clinical evidence to support the clinical evidence of the subject device. And this is one important thing about the two parts of the prick device. In the 2015 guidance, it doesn't mention how many prick device can we choose when we compare the China clinical evaluation report. But in this new formal guidance, it mentioned we can choose one or more prick device. Sorry, please go back. And it also mentioned if we choose the two prick device, maybe one is the primary prick device and the other one should be the secondary prick device. This is one thing. And another thing, they give us two exceptions, or you can think it might be two examples. One is if we if we must to choose two prick device or two comparable prick device 1 and prick device 2, and they might have two different design features. So when these two design features combined into the subject device, and we can show this combined design will not affect the safety and efficacy of the subject device. Then we can choose the two different prick device which has a little different design features. For example, if we the subject device might be a suture which has a bubble or coated, and we might first choose the first prick device which just has the bubble. The second prick device might be just a coated suture. This is for one example. And the other one is about the scope of application. And also in this guidance, it mentioned that if we need to choose 1, 2, or 3 prick device, they might have 3 different or 2 or 3 different scope of application. But when we combine all the scope of application, it should be the scope of application of the subject device. Then we can use this different scope of application of the prick device as our prick device in the clinical evaluation report. So this guidance gives us these examples and tell us that which device can be chosen as the potential prick device. Next page. Next page. When we know what is the prick device, and we will try to find it whether it is the right prick device. So we need to compare with the subject device. Previously, for either for the active or non-active device, we need to compare the 16 items to know whether they are similar. But now in this new guidance, it mentioned that we need to compare 3 aspects. One is scope of application. The second is technical characteristic. And the third is the biological characteristic. If you know, I know, I also saw that in EU MDR, maybe you need to compare these 3 parts, but for some items, it might be included in different aspects. For example, in the scope of application, in China guidance, it included 11 items, hence we need to compare these 11 items. But for example, for one, it might be listed in the technical part in the EU MDR. So you need to compare that one in the technical part. So let me have a detailed discussion on the scope of application. The first thing is about the comparison of the indication for use. In this guidance, it also mentioned we just want to show that the scope of the application is the same between subject device and the operated device, that it doesn't mean the indication must be the same. How to understand this? How to understand this sentence? Let me give you an example. For example, if we want to register a product of a hip joint prosthesis fixed without bone cement, that the scope of application might be hip joint replacement. That is for what we will do. And we used this device is to recover joint function and relieve pain. But the indication might be RA and might be primarily the degenerative arthritis. So in this case, that the indication might be different, but the scope of application should be the same. This is what I'm understanding. And the second is about the patient population. I'm not sure. In my experience, it's really difficult to find the age or sex limitation in the IBU of the device for suture. Usually, it can fit for all age of the patients. So in this new regulation or in this new guidance, we need to emphasize or we need to explain the sex or the age we might use with this subject device. That will be a little challenge for us. And for below item, I think maybe the type of content and the duration of use, this item may be included in the technical part in EU MDR. And the next item, the stage and the severity of disease, in my personal understanding, I think basically it's difficult to find the similar between the subject device and the equivalent device, but it might be the same, maybe easily. And the next is about the condition of use, repeated use, application method, control interdiction, warning, and precaution. I think it might be easy for us to find it from the IFU. But if you have any complicated or any how to say, or any misunderstanding, we need to have a deep description in this part. And also previously we met a issue that we see something in the control indication that maybe this device is we don't have enough clinical evidence, so we think maybe if we use this device in some side of the application, we need to pay much more attention. But at this case, the reviewer asked us more questions that they think, because they think if you don't have enough clinical evidence, you should say it is not fit for this indication, or we should think that this device cannot be used in this application. So we might argue much more with the reviewer. That is my opinion about the scope of application. The second thing is about the technical characteristic. In this part, we need to compare the design information, the materials, the energy, and the product performance functions, and other key technical features. Previously, I read the EU NMPA regulation that it mentioned that you can only choose the same material device as the pricked device. I'm not sure my understanding is really correct, but I think in China, for the orthopedics products, it's really difficult to find the similar design and the same material as the pricked device. Previously, we had to choose the two pricked device. One is have the similar design, and one is has the same material, and to try to draft the clinical evaluation report, and that's what we do in this case. And the third part is about the biological characteristics. Previously, when we do the comparison table as what we did in the left side, and we don't need to mention much more about the biological part. We just let the reviewer know that we follow the standards and we follow the regulations from other requirements. But in this new guidance, we need to give some summary about the degeneration performance, the results, and also we need to give the results of the biological response, such as immune response, tissue integration. But we are not sure how many or how much detailed information should be covered in this part. Maybe when we submit maybe several reports, we can know the opinions from the reviewer. Next page. After we gave the fully comparison between the subject device and the prick device, we will have a clear mention that whether the the comparison pathway is enough or not. And we will also to evaluate whether we need more clinical data or clinical trial data to support our submission for the subject device. So also in the template of the clinical guidance of how to drive the clinical evaluation report, it gave us the two choices that we need to choose the clinical evaluation pathway. We can choose either one, or we can choose both of them. And if we also need to choose the clinical trial pathway, and for local clinical trial, we need basically we need to follow the GCP, the China GCP. And if we follow the overseas clinical trial, we need to follow the overseas guideline. And if we need to cover the multiple regional clinical trial data, I think we need to follow the two guidance. Next, after we evaluate which pathway we need to go, then we need to know how to weight or how to evaluate the evidence, the clinical evidence. As the guideline had mentioned, if when we know how many clinical evidence we have, the first thing we need to summarize this clinical data, that how many clinical data we have, then we need to evaluate the criteria of this clinical data, and it has give us two tables. And the next page, please. The table 1 shows us whether the literature or whether the clinical data is suitable. So we need to evaluate from these 4 parts. The first is about the device, whether the touch device has been mentioned and whether it is the cohort device. For example, it just mentioned maybe ABC device has been used in this clinical trial or in these articles, but it didn't distinguish how many device has been used in how many patients. So we might distinguish into these 3. And also we need to evaluate whether the device has been on-label used or off-label used. And also we need to evaluate the patient group, and we need to evaluate the quality of the article. And the next page is we need to evaluate the outcomes and the follow-up, the statistic part of the article, and we know the weight of the article. But also in the guidance, it doesn't mention that we need to calculate the weight. We just to let the reviewer know that for each section or each subgroups, how many, how about the articles? Please go ahead, go back, and go back. Okay, and after we evaluate the clinical data, and we need to emphasize the tool. Oh yeah, this page, we need to know for some data, which data is about the performance and which data show the safety. And for the safety part, we can also include the post-marketing data. And the post-marketing data we need to evaluate and to emphasize and whether this adverse event is related to the device, and how to have some of the description, the action of this event. And next, Grace, next page about the clinical trial. Next one. After we evaluated the clinical articles and we know this weight of this evidence, and if we have this evidence, clinical trial data need to mention in the clinical evaluation report, and in the guidance it mentioned that we need to emphasize the clinical trial data from 3 parts. And the first thing is about the design consideration, why we want to design this clinical trial, and how about the population, something like this. And after that, we needed to give the general summary of this clinical trial. And also we needed to have some briefly summary about which documents we need to attach in this clinical evaluation report. For local or overseas data, it has a different requirement of which documents must be attached. And after all this mentioned, we can have a small conclusion that according to this non-clinical and the clinical evidence, and also about the post-marketing data, and whether we have the sufficient evidence to support the scope of application of the which we have claimed in the FUO labels. And after that, we need to summarize the next page, to have a conclusion of our clinical evaluation report. This conclusion should be covered from 3 parts. The first part is just Grace has mentioned we need to comply with the ER. And the second one is about our clinical part that we need to support the safety and the efficacy of our data. And the third part is the most important part because this is a new added part from the guidance that it mentioned that we must to evaluate the benefit and risk, whether we can get benefit of the separate device. And also this guidance has mentioned, and if the company want to conduct the post-marketing study, we need to mention it, but this is not must. And but I know in EU MDR, it is the must part. The company needs to emphasize in the report. And the last is about the clinical evaluator. Previously, we don't have this part, and here we need to mention that whether the writer and the reviewer has the expertise that to drive this clinical evaluation report or to review it. That's for the all clinical evaluation report. And the next 2 pages, I just have a small comparison and what's the difference between the previous guidance and the new issued guidance, either from the definition or from the choice of the prick device, and about the conclusion of the also about the clinical evaluator. And the next page is about the comparison that about the structure of the clinical evaluation report. Previously, we just have around 4 or 5 sections, but now we also have these sections, but we need to have more detailed emphasis about the research and the development background, and also about the SOA part of the disease which we related with the survey device. And here I want to mention that in the new guidance, it mentioned that the medical record data can be used in the clinical evaluation report. But really, from my personal experience, I'm not sure which data can be used about the medical record, and whether they will have other requirements to use this data. That's all for my part. Sorry, time is over. Yeah, I know the prick device should be registered in China. That's the required by the guidance. Yes, the subject device should have the same scope of application of the equivalence and the similar device. And maybe I think the subject device may be lower or less than the same scope of application of equivalence or similar device. I think it's also fine. Same or less, not extend. Or to consider rate of sorry. I'm reading.
Oops, sorry, I was muted. Okay. So I'm starting from the beginning of the questions. If we didn't get a chance to reply to you, we will reply to you by email at the end. So start from the beginning. We start with the first question is from Alexandra. Do we have to periodically update the CR for China? If yes, would this have to be done for products already registered or only for new registered? at this point, there is adverse events and reevaluation, and then there's another document that's for post-market. Depending if it's during the first cycle approval, there's no strict guideline like MDR you have to submit for the post-market approved products. For new products, hopefully today's discussion would guide you on what's needed. So there is a PRER report that's for the post-market, and then the reevaluation, clinical reevaluation, that's another scenario. So there's no clear-cut answer for this for post-market, depending on your product risk, and then whether it's a conditional approval. If it's a conditional approval, you're required for a post-market report, and then you do it every 5 years at the submission time, or depending on your post-market situation. So there's no strict there. And then the next question is, let's go to the next question. The next question is, let's see, this is some technical issues. Does Order 739 address or cover how or whether data from trials executed in China can be sent outside of China? This is from Scott. No, 739 at the law level is very high level. Whether data can be sent out of China, especially depending on what the data is. For overseas company, you have the special step of the human genetic approval process. And then usually in that category, you're not allowed to send it outside of China. Okay, it's regulated, as somebody answered it already, by HGRAC, the human genetic area. That's an application for a clinical trial part of the pathway. It's not regulated, mentioned in the 739. That's clinical trial. There's a more detailed guidance in there for the clinical trial. Is there any, this other question is from Fan. Is there any gap analysis between NMPA clinical evaluation guidelines versus EU clinical evaluation? This would have to come from big company or other company specific resources. In this webinar, we did not address this gap analysis. That could be a future talk. To address more of the comparison between EU and China. The next one, okay, I'm just trying to read through these. There are a lot of other comments, so I'm trying to read through which are the question.
Grace, actually, the next question is from Jamie.
Okay.
Does the predictive device need to be registered in China? Does the predicated device need to be registered in China?
Yes, that was addressed during our talk. It's the predicate device in the draft mode doesn't need to be, but in the final required mode, it is. It has to be NMPA China approved to be legitimate predicate device. But remember, I also mentioned in the clinical trial decision tree, the type of clinical trial data you can use because of the delay. If you have a second generation product that you can prove the difference for the clinical data, technical requirements can be linked to the previous generation. And then, that's your second generation predicate based on the first generation's data. In that exceptional situation, you have your own first, second generation. That first generation is not approved in China, but certain data from that first generation can be leveraged to the second generation. The next question is, subject device must have the same scope of application or equivalent or similar device. I think Dr. John has explained about this already. Hopefully that's clear. Let me see. Do you see any other urgent questions that need to be addressed, Dr. Zhang or Veronica or anybody else?
Nothing urgent, but there's just been from Jonathan. He's curious about will there be a similar presentation to be given that will focus on IVDs? Is it
Okay.
possible to highlight some of the differences for IVDs?
Veronica, we can certainly do that. Let's talk that offline with Kyle.
Okay, thank you.
Let's see the last, how is predicate device registered in China if being used as equivalent on the basis of approval in the US, EU, not yet approved in China? I think we answered this one. So if you have a device not approved in China, but approved in the US and EU, unfortunately, there's no clear cut there. You have to, because the good thing is, as I mentioned, with all the different versatile pathway and the permutations, about accepting more real world data, clinical experience data, in addition to your traditional GCP trial versus predicate. So it's the total package aligned with some of the clear guidance. Again, like I think at the end of the day, the initial release in 2014 when the CER was first released, and this new updates definitely is relaxed a lot more, provided a lot more clear guidance in some of the gray areas. The next step is really, as an industry, we have to share our knowledge and best practices, because this is all brand new for a lot of companies, and how this been interpreted in reality, that's a different thing, right? Maybe in half a year next year, as this new regulation being really practiced and have been gone through a few products approvals, we can do more best practice sharing with everyone. But the end result is from this presentation, it's really, the direction is positive. There are a lot more clearance. So if you have any questions afterwards, please feel free to contact us. And that's the end of our presentation. Thank you so much for listening. Veronica, back to you.
All right, Grace and Dr. Zhang, thank you so very much for this presentation today. I want to thank everyone for joining us. Please be on the lookout for a post event survey. And we look forward to seeing you at our next event. Thank you, everyone, and have a great day.